wait until consent goes away when you don't receive any positive affirmations from the opposite end, and how we maintain that in the steady state. As, one of the problems with using stun transactions is they take longer to complete with the default timers than our agreed upon consent timers work out. So let's work through some of this, and we'll see how we go. We go to the next one, please. All right. So we get initial consent with ICE. First question. If not refreshed, expires after n seconds, where n equals question mark. Now, 30 seconds is what's being proposed. I think that's what we've talked about in the past, but I just wanted to confirm that. Does anyone have a problem with 30 seconds? Now, 30 seconds is a long, long time. It really is, right?
Fine with it.
This is what we've talked about in the past, right?
I mean, what would be an argument against that? That seems just fine. I mean, the gnats are going to do you in there anyway, so.
So I guess the only concern here is, like, at what point do we just give up and walk away anyway? I mean, the whole point of this is to deal with consent, and I think it's probably okay. We talk about
circuit breakers is going to kill you before that.
Yeah. This is the thing. Circuit breakers are going to kill you before that.
Gnats are going to kill you after that. I mean, I think you're arguing about a number that doesn't matter. You're in between the bounds of two other numbers.
Okay, good. I'm just making sure that we.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with 30 seconds, but I would also have no problem with 5 minutes.
Sure.
I think basically we need to pick a number so employers know what to do, and this seems like a fine number.
And the issue with the length of the stun transaction with default timers, I think we should fix that by respecifying the timers to be used, obviously, right? I mean, the timers were totally wrong. We all know why they were done. No one thought they were right at the time, so.
Yeah,
so wasn't it your fault? You see? So I guess one, or maybe I should let you finish your slides, but I mean, are you interested in, are we trying to combine early failure detection with consent here, like we talked about before?
That's later, if we're talking about that. But
well, I mean, the point being that these questions tie in, right? That is to say that if you're going to, that it's not necessary to have it doesn't matter what stun timers you use here if it's a dead man switch. If it's an early failure detection, you need more aggressive timers.
Yeah, so the idea would be that, and there's some discussion on this that we've had, but I'll confess that when the number of emails crosses the 50 mark, I do lose some of the details. So yeah, the main, what's that? It's just me. Yeah, okay, thanks, Justin. The question that we've had some debate amongst the group of people listed on the first slide here is what options we have with respect to continuing maintenance of this. Obviously, consent is refreshed every time you receive a positive, authenticated response to a stun request, basically. So if it's a valid stun request with a valid digest that has the transaction ID that matches something that you sent relatively recently, then you have consent. The question is, how do we continue to maintain that? And I think we have some more stuff on the next slide in that respect. Should really have the slides in front of me. Okay, option number 1, standard stun transaction. So we just say, set a timer, every seconds you do a stun thingy. And that means send a request, wait, send another request, wait, and then it's got the back off algorithm. The initial timer is based on RTT. I think it's 1.5 times RTT is the default initial retransmission timer for stun transactions, and then it backs off exponentially from there on in. Someone points out that, of course, 500 millisecond RTT is a bit silly, and 7 retransmissions is probably far too many. Yes. But the point being that we would be fixing that in the stun biz work, hopefully, that's going on in TRAM, and we would come up with a number that's less insane and probably fits within this window as a result. You would end the transaction earlier if you are successful. So that's not a problem. So that's option number 1.
I mean, I just make a slight. What stun should do in general and what we should do here are very different in many ways, right? Obviously we have the RTT in this case because it's not the first time.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
All of those things, right? Yep. So we can. This is a non-issue.
So we will have the RTT. So we will be using a different timer. The question is, and you made the point. What stun is doing in general and what we are doing here are very different. So we do actually have the option of going to something like what's on the next slide, which is perhaps better suited to what we're talking about, which is we can request consent by sending a single stun request, a binding request, at a fixed cadence, 1 every 3 seconds, 1 every 7 seconds, and we pick a number, and that gives us, I think, better properties with respect to things like routing flaps and other sorts of transitive conditions. Of course, you don't get to just go send stun transaction and fire and forget in your implementation. You actually have to use the next layer down to do this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the reason to have some sort of back off system ordinarily would be because you don't have you
don't have a positive affirmation in the first place that they're actually there.
You don't have estimates. You don't have estimates of bandwidth or anything like that. So exponential back off is plausible. Here, I don't think exponential back off does any good.
Exactly.
I mean, I know for our implementation, we could this would probably take me a day to do, then Byron a week to clean up. If this is, I'm not yet convinced this is better technically. It seems like basically a very little. I'm basically indifferent between any of these.
Yeah. But I think we just need to make a decision.
If we convince ourselves, so I mean, I guess so. Merely as a matter of saving some time, I suggest that I don't think there's much advantage to this, so I suggest we just stick with regular stun transactions. But if you convince me there's any material benefit at all, I'll be happy to go to this because I think.
Yeah. So one of the concerns that that people had was that the upper bound on the number of stun requests that you send with it in any given interval would be potentially better bounded by having something like this. You wouldn't have the retransmissions. You wouldn't be subject to, dare I say it, buffer bloat causing something to be lost. And then retransmitting as a result of that. So I don't know. It seems like a pretty trivial optimization to do. So yeah.
Magnus Westlund. I think the standard stun retransmission behavior is actually the wrong one when you really want to verify that if consent expires, because you get a lot of packets early and very few in the end of the expiration period. You basically have 1 in the last 15 seconds and the rest 6 is coming from early.
I think that's on the next slide.
What? I'm cheating you.
Oh, damn. Okay. Yeah. So Dan actually did suggest that we do something much like what is done in PCP, where it's basically a liveness check that is maintained by the client that basically says, at a slow cadence initially, are you there? Are you there? And if it doesn't get a response back, it accelerates and sends slightly more toward the end of that expiration period, so that I guess you can close out on the expiration period with far more confidence, and basically invert the exponential back off.
Yes, I think that's maybe more appropriate. Or I mean, even
write something up, we'll take it.
Or I think I think the fixed cadence is fine because that's actually has. I mean, the fact that you're always counting since the last response, and you're sending with a fixed interval, you're actually getting reasonable number of packets in the end anyway, and you're getting some distance between each packet. You don't need to have them, I think, more intensified actually. So just like regularly sending them, if there's an outage and it recovers, it will clear it. So I think fixed cadence is probably good enough for these solutions.
Yeah, I think it's fairly straightforward to implement. So the transaction would be run at a fixed cadence as well. So you would have transactions running, and there'd be a concern about overlap between the transactions and the fixed timer as well. This sort of avoids those issues.
What actual cadence do you have in mind here?
So there's a question about how many missed packets we want to actually see, and it's just running the numbers with packet loss of 5%. You can get a pretty high confidence with about 5 of them in a window, and I'd probably go 1 every 5 seconds or 1 every. Yeah, I mean that means you'll get 5 in a window, allowing for some jitter, and you'll have to lose 5 in order to expire consent at 30 seconds. So that's pretty good odds with anything but very high packet loss. And if you have very high packet loss, I think we're talking about tripping circuit breakers faster than that.
Would the transaction IDs be the same or change?
Oh, no. They'd have to change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, great.
Guaranteed. And that was one part of our discussion that I did follow, and it's like, no, they have to change every time. Otherwise, there's some interesting spoofing properties that you can.
Right, and you can calculate RTT.
And you can calculate RTT as a result of that. So you can tune your RTT. Not that we don't have other ways to work that out, but.
And just to be clear, this is our specifier. This is specification for the sender side, right? If the other side was using a slightly different algorithm than this for its consent, was like using like the current algorithm or something, everything's still going to work fine, right?
So if you're running ICE Lite, your consent mechanism is I send packets.
Yeah.
Right. So there's basically no consent for gateways running ICE Lite. This is the browser knowing that the other guy is continuing to be willing to receive packets.
Roman speaking. Is there any need to put any sort of randomization either in the cadence or in the initial transmission? Because we don't want essentially, like for instance, servers where you start which recover and start receiving packets and which are synchronized.
So I imagine that we will have to put some amount of jitter on them. That will make the number a little less stable, but like the number of packets that you will receive in a 30-second window a little less stable. But I think that with 5, I think the odds are pretty good.
Like a typical thing would do is say make it random between 4 and 5 seconds since the previous one, right? It's still going to give us the same window. It doesn't change the math.
That would be fine. 4 to 6, 5 plus or minus 1, I think is perfectly good. I think I have more slides, but I'm not sure what's on them. See. Oh yeah, explicit revocation.
Sorry, should we conclude the previous? So saying we're going with fixed cadence or randomized fixed cadence in the region of 4 to 6 seconds.
Yes, I think that's randomized fixed. That sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll give some people conniptions, but that's a bonus, I guess. Isn't that what we're here for? Okay, whatever you want, Ted. Okay, explicit revocation. Now this is another long discussion. You can revoke consent by closing the DTLS connection. Is the promise here. So that is, if you receive an authenticated message that is a definitive end of session, that ends consent. And I believe the only option we have in that regard is a TLS fatal alert. And so if you received an authenticated packet that said this is the end of the session, you should also end consent. That would allow someone to terminate. And that's not a guarantee that you're going to receive that packet. An attacker might be able to suppress that packet so that you continue to receive data. But if someone sends you, no, go away, we don't want your DTLS anymore, then that you should respect that, I think. Unauthenticated messages that close connections, such as a TCP reset, don't indicate that consent has been required. And that prevents intermediaries from resetting your TCP connection on you to stop you from continuing.
A random other number, RTCP by?
We had a long discussion about this. I'll answer this after Jonathan has actually said something.
I will
answer that.
Okay. So my question is, does a failure response to the consent request revoke consent? If I send back an error response to the consent request?
I said unauthenticated one or unauthenticated one? If it's authenticated, then I think that is okay, isn't it? As a revocation of consent.
Are the consent requests themselves authenticated? I mean, you have to be on path, obviously, but I don't think we're putting are we putting the ICE?
The stun binding request, which means they have the MAC, which means they're authenticated, which means that we could use that.
Yeah, actually, I was uncertain whether those did have the MAC. I don't remember that in the spec, whether we said that whether the consent requests have the HMAC or whether they're just they just have the transaction ID.
So Ekka's responding without a microphone, but basically, yes, they're normal binding requests with the normal MAC. They're authenticated using the UFRAG and password. They have a unique transaction ID in each one of them. If someone sends you a response to that, then they're on path and they have access to your session. That is probably sufficient to say that that is a clean revocation of consent, and we should allow that to be consent is dead, end the session. We might have to look at the different error codes to make sure that there are none of them that are transient sort of error codes, just to make me happy that we're not creating a hole for us to fall into later on. But yes, I think that's a good comment, and we should do that. So Harold asked the question about SRTCP BY. SRTCP BY is authenticated. It indicates that a given SSRC will no longer be received, but it doesn't say anything about any of the other SSRCs in that RTP session, and certainly wouldn't be a good idea to use as the end of session when you're using a data channel, for instance. So we discussed this, and someone was convinced that this was something that we could use. I convinced them that was something we absolutely cannot use. Just like the TCP reset thing, which has some interesting secondary characteristics that, as a practical matter, TCP reset is probably going to screw you over, but it doesn't end consent. Next, please. So we'll take on Jonathan's, just to make sure that gets captured in the notes. We'll take Jonathan's suggestion. We'll make sure that it's good, and we'll put that in. Sorry? Suggestion was if you receive an stun binding response that's authenticated but contains an error code, like the standard stun error, whatever. It's not a binding response. It's the stun error in response to your binding request. That's consent over. And I think that's probably the cleanest way to end consent. Well, the question on codes is a good one, and I need to work out what that code would be, whether it could be any code or whether it has to be a specific subset of codes or a specific one. I think that's what we have to work out. Yes, TCP. Do we need consent for TCP? I think that the answer is, if you're using TCP as the transport between you and the turn server, then you don't need consent for that particular connection, but you do need the end-to-end consent still, so carry on.
I concur with that. I think if you're doing ICE TCP, you do not need consent.
ICE TCP does not need consent, correct?
Because it'll send you an RST. So like, I mean TCP.
Well, it's not authenticated, which is.
But it doesn't matter because you're going to lose the TCP. I mean, you're going to lose the TCP.
As a practical matter, yes.
So it doesn't really. I mean, yes, that is ass, but like that's just what TCP is. If you had TCP crypt, then you know, then the TCP crypt doesn't encrypt the RST, doesn't protect the RSTs either. I think. But,
because they can't, because that would break TCP.
They have to fight. They'll have to fight with this at some point in the future. Like,
it sucks to be them, basically. So I think that's the conclusion there. It doesn't. So TCP reset doesn't end consent still, but as a practical matter, it ends the connection. So I mean, you're not going to be sending anything more on that one anyway. So I don't see that there's much that can be done about that without fixing TCP. Anyone going to volunteer for that? I think Spencer's already got that on his plate, so we'll just move on. Next, please.
Sorry, what should I capture in the notes?
Okay, so TCP is ended as TCP is ended, but we still need consent for anything that might be using UDP. ICE TCP, no. Turn TCP, no, but you still need the end-to-end stuff.
So, Justin, you've already, if we're interested in the RTT stuff, you know, you could still send consent checks here.
That's a good point, and I think perhaps we should just permit them. I mean, most people's stacks are going to just take the things that look like UDP packets once the TCP abstraction has been done with them and just process them as.
I'm fine with that as well. I don't care.
I mean, it's not necessary, but it's permitted. That's okay.
Yes. So let's capture that as well, please, Magnus. You can send consent checks for these secondary benefits that people might be using them for, and it is pretty nice to know what your RTT is. We need people to look at the draft, and once these issues are done, I'm not aware of anything else. So, based on the conclusions that things we've concluded today, I think we're in pretty good shape.
So, with my chair hat on for a second, when can we expect a rev from you?
I will ask my co-authors, who are on the line, as I understand. One of whom, I should say. Jonathan.
Yeah, sorry, I was just pondering the concept of not needing consent for ICE TCP. Are we positive that ICE TCP isn't being gatewayed to some ICE intermediary that still needs consent to flow through it?
Well, since we decided to have consent for ICE TCP, we do not have. We can skip over this question.
Okay, sorry, I must have gotten distracted. I apologize.
Sorry, I misheard. I thought we decided to make it optional, not
no, we
have.
made it optional, didn't we?
Yeah. So,
well, if
I was wondering the same thing as Jonathan.
Yeah.
So if you're running to the gateway, the typical scenario is that consent is to the next hop. If there's something happening on the other side of that, then
that's how I'd evaluate it.
That's their business.
I would claim the same thing, that it's the gateway's responsibility to take care of this. If it eventually turns out that, like, you know, this is bear in mind that the reason that we have this need at all is not primarily about mobility of the sync of the data.
Yeah.
It's not about, like, is not primarily about it's not primarily about allowing the same person to abruptly terminate the data. It's primarily about like avoiding a situation where I'm permanently spamming some lame access point. And so, anything that is an ICE TCP to ICE UDP intermediary probably has a permanent IP address and probably is not I'm not saying we shouldn't write consent for those guys, but it's a much lower order kind of issue.
And they can send the TCP reset, thank you very much, if they don't want to receive those packets anymore. And on the other side, they should be maintaining an independently consented communication.
I mean, do I understand this case right? If you have the turn TCP, that you use TCP to a turn server, then the WebRTC endpoint needs to verify consent over for the packets all the way to the other endpoint.
Correct, yes. So if you're using a relay, you have two levels of consent effectively, one to the relay and one to the peer on the other side of that relay. That's not changing. But the question was more if you've gotten all the way to the other end and that other end is then subsequently sending that media onward to someone else.
Well, that's clearly their responsibility, yeah. I fully agree.
Yeah.
So.
All right. So I'm going to talk to my co-authors about a rev to the draft that captures the things that we got just now.
So your co-author Muthu in the chat says, I think we can respin it pretty quickly as the changes look pretty minor.
They are pretty minor. So I'm thinking weeks, not months.
Okay.
As in 2, probably. But I don't want to make too big a promise on that one.
Okay. This is the last thing we had on our agenda for...
We can hand off.
Today. So before we take off this hat and change hats to being the W3C Media Capture Working Group, are there any other topics that we need to cover on the IETF side for today? Okay, so you heard some heartfelt words from Harold yesterday about timing and schedule, and many of them turn out to have dependencies on the IETF side. So as soon as these drafts are respawned, we're really going to be looking for review. For the security drafts, we expect to have review very quickly, and of course for data channel, we're going to go to working group last call. We won't start a whole bunch of working group last calls in parallel, so the data channel working group last calls will probably come first. But you can expect at least one call for review on each of these before we go to Toronto. I know it's looking closer and closer now, but we really do need this stuff to be on track so we can meet the overall schedule. Thanks, and if I could call the Media Capture Working Group chairs up so that they can call their working group to order. In the meantime, the IETF session under NoteWell is now closed.
So just some practical details. The chat room for the Media Capture Task Force is still Media Cap on the IRC server for and on the W3C IRC server. And in order to not confuse things totally, we're continuing to use the same recording session and Hangout as with the RTCWEB, just because it's just inviting trouble to try to switch in the middle of the Hangout. In this session, we have a single topic, a single presenter. Peter Thatcher is going to present some more words on possible modifications to our favorite topic, constraints. The slides are on the Media Capture wiki page. Amazingly, I think you can also find them. Did you share them with them? So you can find them in Google Docs. So this is even more ad hoc than our usual ad hocness. So sorry about the confusion. Dom will scribe. Thank you. Thank you, Dom. Okay, we have the PDF version. Peter. Yes, this is that. So in the near future, when we have all our meetings so virtually over WebRTC, all this will be solved, right? Yes, I'm just filling out the stage until Peter has the slides ready.
Now I get to fill the recording. All right, so we're talking about constraint syntax. Next slide. The problem that we had on Monday, I think it was that we were stuck because we couldn't agree. So I thought I'd ask around to lots of people to find out what is the sticking point. I was kind of new to the subject, and I was interested to hear what everyone thought. So after talking to a lot of people, I found out the real problem and source of conflict was, next slide, this required hacky thing. I was a little surprised that was the main sticking point, but that's what everyone seemed to agree was the thing that if we could get rid of that, then we could have some consensus and be able to move on. So the question then became, how can we get rid of this thing? So backing up a little, we asked, like, why do we have it in the first place? Next slide. And the basic gist of it is that we have this combination of WebIDL and must fail, and two don't go together, so we need this hack. So can we do something else? Well, actually, backing up again, next slide. We kind of have three different options. One is to toss WebIDL. One is to add a hack, and perhaps door number 3 is letting the JavaScript do a little check about what's supported. So number 1, tossing WebIDL seems that no one really wants to do. Number 2, adding the hack is how we got where we are. So maybe we can try door number 3. Next slide. This is the gist of it. You might have to squint a little. Before we'd have something where we say required with this hacky string thing. And now instead, we add a new method to the media stream track, a static method, which says get supported constraints. This is just a map telling you which things you can constrain on. And so if the JavaScript checks, is this something I can constrain on before it calls get user media, then it can treat it like an error if that's what it wants to do, rather than passing it in this hacky way and then having it give an error. So next slide. The pros are basically that we don't have this hack anymore. It's prettier. We can keep progressing in our standardization. we don't have to deal with this side issue of what happens when you specify something in required in the hacky way but don't actually include it. The big con, the trade-off, is that if the JavaScript fails to do this check and says it requires something that the browser does not support, then the browser would have to silently ignore it, and then JavaScript developer would have to go, oh, I need to check to see if it's supported first. So it is a trade-off, but that's the gist of it. Next slide. So I asked around to a lot of people, everyone that was passionate about this subject on Monday, and everyone was happy with it. So now the question is the greater group happy with this trade-off? Go back to the example of it? Okay. 2 slides. Yeah, there we go.
Hello, Gary Mundy, I'm Qualcomm Innovation Center. Peter, on the after example, let's assume that we just want to do what's supported today with the where we would still have video : true, right? And that would be the that would be useful for the developer who doesn't care about any of this stuff, right?
I didn't quite follow the question. I have nodding heads over here, but I didn't understand the question.
The answer should be yes. Okay. Yeah, you only had true. Yeah. The only thing the reason I was asking is the only place you had true in your email was that required : true. I said no. Video : true is also a valid constraint as well.
Yeah, that's correct. This is Dan Burnett. This is only showing what's changed from what's in the current draft. That's all. So the video : true. So that shortcut still exists.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I understand what you mean now. Sorry. The answer is yes. Anybody want to pass around microphones?
There are thumbs up happening in the room.
Okay, I have one. Let's see, one question.
One dumb. So great. I guess my only comment is on whether we actually need a method versus a static property for supported constraints. But that's
that was brought up on the list, and I think someone pointed out that you can't have a dictionary that's a property without running into issues.
That's correct. Okay. Anyway, thanks. That's a great proposal to me.
Yeah, and I just want to point out one other feature of the new proposal is not only can you tell before by calling get supported constraints whether a property is there or not, if afterwards you apply it and the property is silently ignored, when you do get settings or get current constraints, it won't be there. So there are a number of places where the app can tell that something was ignored. You don't just have to call beforehand to find out it doesn't support this. If you check afterwards what constraints apply, you'll see that your constraint is not there. That's just an observation.
This is Jan Mozilla. I support this proposal. I would like to point out that the JavaScript developer gets more information this way, and they get it earlier before they even call GOM. And that gives them more choices.
So, Martin Thompson, I missed the entire thread, so excuse my misunderstanding. The get supported constraints, why is that a dictionary?
So the
What are the
advantages, the advantage of a dictionary over a list are, first, it's easier to check for a particular thing, and second, it gives us more flexibility later if we want to expand what get supported constraints means.
So the idea is that the value is a Boolean.
Yeah, at least to start off with. Maybe in the future we would want to have something else. So there's flexibility and some ease of check.
So one thing that I observe is that if you want to do what Dom suggested and return a dictionary from a property, you can do so. You just don't return a dictionary, you return an interface. We can just define it as an interface rather than a dictionary. I think that solves that problem.
Dictionaries can be returned.
Okay. I was saying go back to having it be a property, I think.
I was suggesting a property rather than a. So if we have it as a straight up attribute and it returns an interface, we define that interface. That interface can have methods on it if we really want to ultimately, but we don't need them. And how do we deal with audio video was the other question that I had. So MST, I'm assuming, is media stream track. It's a static method on that thing.
So we could either have them all together, or you'd have to have two separate ones. It's a good question.
Because Firefox has very different supported constraints for video and audio. But now we could just simply express them as the union of the two and say this is fine.
Yeah,
that might be okay.
I think that we're unlikely to have too many where we define the same name for audio and video to mean completely different things, where a browser would support depth in audio but not depth in video. Like we're down an insane path of that. So I think this is just, you understand the tag. It doesn't even mean you do it. It means you understand the tag depth.
Okay, so
you just have a parameter to get supported constraints saying the media type if you want to.
So that I think what we need.
I mean, if you could have something where it's not supported for audio, but it is for video, and then you specify it, and then you don't know if it's going to work or not.
So all you need to know is whether the browser will correctly return an error when it sees required true on this property.
That's what you need. And if it's required and the browser doesn't support it, then it's still required.
I mean, all it's saying supported is not that you support the feature. It's saying that your web IDL won't remove the depth from the dictionary that's passed in, and that will happen in either way, and that's all it means. So I mean, we could extend this more complicated, but I think this totally solves it as it is.
Yeah, I'm still wondering about the utility of the interface, but that's fine.
But we would still need a real draft, right? A real proposal, and in that case, we can figure out the nitty-gritty.
So one question I had on this, which is kind of orthogonal, MST.get supported constraints. We had another thread on the mailing list where, or was it in the chat room, where someone suggested introducing navigator.device manager in order to have something to fire device change events at. Would it be better to put it as a method on that instead of having it MST?
I'm on the queue, but that was kind of reading to my question. I would prefer that not hanging on the MST as well, because I mean that requires that you have to get an MST. No. So what does it mean then? So what would be the advantage? And I don't.
We just need someone to hang this thing off. And
yeah,
I think Harold's
but I mean, you would have to have a representation of MST in the.
JavaScript has an object for each defined type. Media stream track with a capital M is a predefined name. So it exists.
Yeah. Okay. So it exists. So what do we need? So then, what do we need your suggestion for then?
I don't like static methods.
Yeah, I think device manager is better. We've been sad about adding things to media stream track as static methods in the past, and get devices or get whatever it was called before. So the device manager sounds good to me.
Okay.
I'm happy with another home also. We just didn't want to add another top
level. This is Dan. I was going to say, yeah, I don't know that I really care exactly where it goes. I think one of the reasons we thought of this, in fact, we initially were talking about perhaps putting it at a higher level, but I think the reason for this was just in case there might end up being some conflict with the naming. Between audio and video, maybe there's not going to be a conflict, but if you just start making it sort of at a higher level, a more generic level, then you could increase the possibility down the road that you'll have some kind of naming conflict. But that's pretty minor at this point, I think.
So I just want to say, yesterday I said I'd send out a proposal sometime, and I set a time way too long, which I apologize. I realized later the working group wanted something much faster. So I sent out something yesterday morning, and then that, Peter put together a much better proposal that met the objects of what I was trying to succeed, which is this one. So that, I like this, and I think this, gets to the problem I was having before. So thank you.
We go back to the consensus call slide. One more.
So being a formalist, well, not really, but I can then play chair again and say, okay, let's see if we have rough consensus in the room, and then so alternative one is Peter or someone should be charged by the group to come up with a complete with a carefully written up proposal that makes this change. Alternative two is no, this is bad, we should not do it. This change is bad, we shouldn't do it. So who thinks that we should ask for a completed proposal that can be integrated in a spec based on this idea? Raise your hand. Who thinks we should not? We have consensus in the room. The chairs are going to assume that this represents the consensus of the group. Thank you.
Peter.
Okay, next slide.
When can we expect the proposal?
Everyone else keeps saying a couple weeks, but so a couple weeks?
Well, the sooner the better.
Okay.
June 7th. In this grand scheme of things, this is minor change. So it comes up with a yeah.
And it's coming on top of the group saying we like this, the whole group saying we like this direction. So yeah.
So we still have a little time before it's scheduled lunch.
Yeah, could I add one thing too? I'd like to propose that the existing text, even though it's in the editor's draft, be ripped out and this put in there, so all mention of advanced constraints and all the other variations be removed.
No.
No.
Yeah.
What does that
Discussed taking out advanced. We have not discussed this.
We haven't discussed putting it in. It was put in. It was put in over without group consensus as well. Why should we have something in there that hasn't been discussed?
Because it replicated optional.
Huh? Well, I know.
If you want to raise a proposal for taking out advanced, make that proposal, but it does not affect the disposition of this item.
Right. This is a modification to what's in the current editor's draft. That's how this was presented.
Either addresses constraints or it doesn't. Anything else?
Use the mic.
This proposal represents constraints. It represents the baseline consensus on constraints. Therefore, it should be in the document. Everything else regarding constraints, including advanced, does not represent baseline consensus within the group. Therefore, should be removed.
Okay, I'll ask the group. Should we have the discussion now on whether advanced should be in the constraints or not? This is a point of agenda order, not the point of not the point of the
I was going to propose a way to quickly resolve this and move forward, because I think in my mind, the consensus is relatively clear. So that consensus call you just had was about the proposed change to what's in the document today becoming the consensus of the working group. And yesterday we had ideal as well, that had the same thing. Perhaps we could take a consensus call on, are people okay with the next version of the document will have what's in it now, plus this change, plus ideal. I mean, that seemed to be the thing that seemed to have broad consensus to me, but I'm not a chair.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about next, and I had a few ideas on slides.
Do you have more slides?
So let's stay on this slide for a second.
You're done.
The future slides are ones that may be causing more discussion and not have as much consensus. So if we fail, we fall back to this baseline consensus, right? Okay, so I make that clear. Next slide.
Sorry for not having reviewed the slides before.
All right, so one thing we could do is, although we agreed we could put required true on each of the constraints, we could instead make that the default, and if you want it optional, you have some way of indicating optional. So we flip around the default basically. And the advantage of this is that if a JavaScript developer says they want something like 640 by 480, but then gets back 320 by 240, they're not confused about why that happened. And they don't have to go look up the documentation and see that there's this extra flag that they have to set. You know, the do what I said flag. And it plays well or nicely with the idea of advanced or ideal. You show the next slide. So there would be two ways that you could indicate that something was optional, assuming that required is the default. One way would be to say it's ideal, that's what's on the right, and the other way would be to put it in the advanced list, which is on the left. So in other words, if we have either one of these or both of these, you don't need to say required true on everything. You could just make that the default, and then if you wanted it non-required, you would go and put one of these things. Along with that, there were some ideas that people had in discussions over the last few days about how we could define ideal in a way that was more compatible with advanced. And if you show the next slide, it was basically the idea that you would define ideal in terms of advanced, where you would say ideal, what you see on the left, is as if you had typed something advanced, what you see on the right. Kind of you can imagine it as a macro expansion, or what you would need to accomplish the same thing on the right, but in a more concise form on the left. So this could give us a more deterministic way of defining ideal. So obviously there are some details we can discuss. I'll just go to the next slide to show a full example of ideal plus advanced plus required is the default, to give you an idea what it could look like. So I present this as like an idea that we can discuss where these things all kind of fit nicely well together that can build on top of the baseline consensus that we already have. If it fails, we can move back to the baseline consensus, but at least we have some opportunity to discuss what things could look like if we wanted to make them very nice.
So I think you're doing two things here, and that's a problem. But let's talk about the first thing, because I think the second thing isn't particularly interesting. The second thing being your modeling of ideal as advanced. I think that's theoretical niceness.
You want to go back to the required being the default?
Can we go back to the required being the default slide? This one, okay. I like the next slide actually. That one worked out a little bit better for me. So these are the ones that are more interesting to me. So I'm wondering whether the thing that we're using on the left there is not something we could use as the undecorated version. So when you say width 640, you're actually specifying an ideal rather than a min-max range.
Well, if it's in advanced, it means it's optional. So yeah.
No. Your syntax on the right.
Oh, on the right.
And if you remove the braces and just have the 640 in there, and that meant ideal.
I think the question is, loosely speaking, we used to have the convention that if you wrote width colon 640, that meant width colon object min 640 max 640, right? And maybe we should change the convention so width colon 640 means width colon open bracket ideal 640 close bracket. And then that would allow you to write that slide. Okay, outside of advanced, then it would allow you to write that slide just as, you know, width colon 640, height colon 640 or 40.
Well, the question is, if you just put a number, is it required
what
or
they
not?
expect?
But my question is, if you just put the number, if you go back to the previous slide. Ed?
Well, now everything is required by default. So if you just say width 640, height 480, that means required 640, 480. And exactly ideal, by its very name, is not required. So it's
Dom, we can't hear you up here if you don't use the mic.
now the thing is, the default now, if you don't, unless you specify ideal, if you just specify constraints, you don't leave out ideal for a moment, then everything, you don't have to specify required true anymore. Right, so everything by default is required, unless you use the ideal key, which is impervious to required because it's inherently optional. And
but I think Martin's point is that instead of making required the default, we make ideal the default. That is, the value you put in front of width defines the ideal value unless you specify the full-blown object.
So if you want hard constraints, you specify minimums and maximums or one or the other. Otherwise, you just get what you want.
But
so that is the browser can possibly provide. I think this is the usability benefit that we're looking
for. Actually, if we go back to your first slide or two, you actually explain the motivation for that.
I think it's down one. This one?
Yeah, it was that on the left. Maybe you should just walk through that example.
Okay. So the idea is, if the JavaScript developer does this and they get back 320 by 240.
Which can happen if that means ideal rather than required.
Is that what we want to have happen?
This is Adam. I think Martin is onto something here, because I think you should be, if you want something strict, I think then you should be prepared to do some extra work. I mean, add some extra property or something. And if you are fine with but want to steer in some direction, just adding the numbers is
all right. So
is enough. So I think.
Yeah, I agree with what Adam just said. I think that the cases where you want to get something or fail are actually for like resolution, it's actually fairly limited. I think that typically it's like, well, here's really what I want, but if you can only give me something pretty close, I want the application to work and not stop work, not fail. The issue I have is that I still don't see it anyway. If ideal only has a syntax, as is shown here on the slide, how do you say I want maximum of 1080p, minimum of 360p, but what I really want is 720p?
Well, I put that on the last slide as an example.
So there's still ideal can be like a property, but the default. Okay, great.
Well, so a follow-up question to the.
So this slide in particular, if the browser's not giving you 640 by 480, there's a good chance that it can't, because it should be trying to get you 640 by 480. If this were, implicitly ideal and nothing else, then you would get 640 by 480 if the browser could get you that. And if you got 320 by 240, well, that's probably just because the browser couldn't. Or maybe was disinclined to for some reason. But if you really wanted something hard, then you should use hard limits.
All right, so let me ask you this. If right here under width, instead of having 640, you had min 640, max 640, but you didn't put required, what would you expect?
So the removal of required, as you were suggesting, is good. And I'm basically agreeing with that.
Okay.
And saying that if you say min 640, max 640, and you don't get 640, the browser would be required to fail. That's great.
So you want required defaulted to true.
Required defaulted to true.
But a number means ideal.
But a bare number just means ideal.
I was getting up to say exactly that. I think that sounds just ideal.
Can someone write that down? Note taking. Okay, in that case, what about the case where you have facing mode and an enum?
Yeah.
And you just put a bare value as the same as a bare number. Is that required?
That means that's the same as writing ideal as a.
So I say front-facing camera, and it gives me the back-facing camera.
Yeah. How do you make?
So how do you specify that stipulation is a hard one, a required one?
It really has to be the back-facing camera.
If you really want it to be the facing one, you put min environment.
Ooh,
and the distance metric. I mean, the distance metrics of strings is the usual, 0, 1. Okay, you're right. Never mind. I retract that insane suggestion.
I have a suggestion which is not particularly elegant, but is you provide an object and you wrap the thing that you wanted in required colon front,
so like
or
this.
required colon left. It's ugly.
What if we only made numbers ideal by default, but
so I don't know if
just quickly, no, I think in enumerated cases, there could be cases where you have 3 values, X, Y, and Z. And you can say, it has to be X or Y, and I would prefer it to be Y. So I want mandatory X or Y, but ideal is Y.
So instead of min-max for enumerated values, you have an array of values.
Yes, an array of values, which means it can be any one of these, or it must be any one of these, but I can still specify an ideal.
So a bare thing is ideal, but an array is...
Yeah, something like that. There ought to be some way to state
Like
that. I don't think we have a very good use case in the current set of constraints, but in the general case, I can imagine the camera can be pointing any way except back, and you have 4 values for facing.
Hello, John. I'm sorry, I just lost it again. But we're now into design mode, which I don't like doing on the fly. But I do remember having a year or so of conversation on how people were arguing that we should make required harder to use. And making the syntax for required simpler seems not to make it harder to use. So I'm skeptical. I'm quite skeptical of trying to change the behaviors like this. I kind of like the idea that it kind of seems attractive that min and max are hard limits, and that a complex way of specifying things is a hard limit, while the simple way is the ideal. That it seems like making this sublanguage for specifying constraints somewhat complicated again. And I mean, the simple things should be simple, and the hard things should be possible. But if I'm getting confused, what about the programmer? So, to my mind, the upper right-hand corner on the slide is simply wrong. If you write the quickest possible code for getting a 640 by 480 camera, and you only have 640 by 360, you should get it. Failing because the environment wasn't quite what you expected is most of the time bad. So by default, the simplest way to do things should be soft. Making things fail should be possible. And I'll stop there.
All right, well, for the benefit of the discussion, let's imagine that we take Martin's idea where the bare number means ideal, but the min-max means required.
That's the closest thing I've come to liking, but my head still hurts.
This is Adam Roach. So I think I agree with at least the underlying message there, which is that we don't want hard limits to be surprising. We don't want, things to fail when people aren't saying, I need something to act in a specific way. And to that end, because we have things like we want to say it needs to be exactly this value, which doesn't necessarily make sense when things are not numbers. If we threw in just one more thing, exact, then you get rid of the required thing. You could have like min, max. Exact basically means it has to be this value or I want it to fail. And then you have ideal, which is the implied one. Ideal is a lot easier to use, but if someone says it needs to be exactly this, well, it's pretty obvious that's what they mean.
Remember that you lost the original meaning of required too, which was you have to understand what I'm asking for.
Well, we've just thrown that out. That was the previous presentation, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so what Adam's saying is we take that place where it says value and say, if we say exact.
Yeah, and that implies required, just like min implies required and max implies required.
I like that idea.
I was just going to say that originally I was also against things failing by default. A couple of things have changed. A major foot gun is now gone, where you would get false negatives. And I also think that the simplification of syntax is beneficial. So if there's really clear semantics for how do you specify things that fail and how do you specify things, and if you don't want it to fail, you put it in optional or advanced or whatever we're going to call it. I think that's simpler. So I'm still not sold on the ideal switch what the regular number means. But it seems like a detail. I mean, if that can be postponed and discussed.
But okay, so I think we have two separate things. One is, can we remove required true? And it sounds like we have solutions for that. And the other is, what's the default when there's a bare number? And it sounds like people don't like the idea of having that be required.
To make sure I understood you, Anavar, you like the width colon with a bare number meaning ideal, right? Because that won't fail, to Terrell's point.
Actually, right? No, I actually, well, there's the semantics get more complicated now. So, okay. But it's a detail. So okay. I'll be fine either way, I think.
I think this is, I was going to just comment on Adam's. We always get wrapped up in the numbers, which are much easier than the strings, and we forget the strings, and I think exact. I can't really think of a solution that's going to result in cleaner code that's really clear to programmers about exactly what's happening there than Adam's exact solution, so I like that.
Yeah, so plus one on that, I think at this point, it's worth sending another proposal that actually shows essentially the same thing you have here, but with value replaced with exact, for your enumerated values, and with the bare number meaning ideal, and then just sort of work through the consequences. And for people to see that, alternative as well. And I actually think we're probably going to get pretty close to consensus from what I'm hearing from that.
Yeah, I was going to say that the same. Requiring wrapping with an object for anything that is strict seems like the right thing to do. And then using whatever labels we come up with, and of course always permitting the use of the label ideal, is, I think, the right way to do this. And I think someone should write it up. And I'm willing to do that if not, but I'm sure there are plenty of other people who are capable of doing the same. So let's do that and try to close this out pretty quickly so that the editors can actually do the editing part as quickly as possible, because this is urgent.
It is urgent. I was just going to say one of the challenges that the editors have sometimes had with something that we need to apply is that we go to apply it and then we find that there are all kinds of other ramifications, and so it ends up not being quite so quick sometimes. So this, but this is one where a lot more of the details are getting worked out already just in the conversation we're having. We still need to figure out what ideal means. We've actually sort of left off that whole part of the discussion.
Well, what do we want to do now? I could type up something during lunch if we want to talk about it after lunch, as far as what we.
But maybe that should be like a separate proposal as how to define what ideal means, which is something that actually, when we put ideal in, there has to be some language saying what happens when you specify ideal. So we're going to have to talk about that, but that's a separate piece perhaps from the rest.
I'd love it if you could type up, ignore what the ideal means, but the rest of this thing that we discussed, type it up and rediscuss it for 5 minutes after lunch and take a consensus check on it or something. Because if we could walk away with this nailed, it would be so great.
Okay, I can do that during lunch. Was that it before lunch?
Well, I don't think I can escape Giri yet. But I think you're finished.
Okay.
So the remaining, so I think we have. Let me see. Did you or you, Peter or Martin, took on the task to work out the proposal over lunch? Peter. Yep. And then I don't really need that mic. But Giri raised an issue that I would like to ignore, but I don't think it's appropriate. Should we remove advanced? And the basic purpose of advanced is, as I understand conversations over the last day and the last couple of years, is that sometimes you need to tell the browser which is more important. And you simply cannot do that by specifying a value only once.
So, Harold, I think the way that I understand advanced is that there are cases where you have codependent variables, for instance, width and height, that cannot vary independently, and you need a way to specify a clean fallback path from what you specified initially to alternatives whereby you maintain relationships between properties. So we're talking about the relationship between frame rate and resolution and the different parts of resolution and all those sorts of things. And yes, what you said, but we need it for those purposes.
Yes, I say advanced has two things: the ability to tie variables and the ability to state multiple levels of backoff. Right? Ideal is great if it's this is what I want, otherwise just do something close. But if you want to say, if you can't give me this, try this, and if that doesn't work, try this, try this. It is definitely intended for high-end enterprise software where the developers want a great deal of control of all the details of the application.
So, well,
okay, it's one thing. It's one thing to verbally express it. It's another thing to see how it's expressed in the specification. The way I understand it, and I read through this, and this is one of the things that got me.
Keep talking to the mic.
Yeah,
I can't hear you.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I read through the specification. One of the things that really got me annoyed with advanced is basically that if there wasn't any required constraints, whatever we're calling them now, as according to the text, the algorithm specified in the specification tree, you can specify 1 million pairs of advanced constraints, but the browser is under no obligation to meet them. And if it has only one media stream track, that's you want me to go through that algorithm? I'll show it to you.
I don't. I mean, we can take that. We can discuss it over lunch, but I think that all of us are going to say that's just simply not true.
Well, I mean,
And look, it's a confusing algorithm, hard for me to understand, but glad to sit down and try and see if we can figure out where yeah.
No, the algorithm states if you have things in advanced, if the browser can satisfy them, it must. In that order. All it does is it does not return an error if it does not satisfy them.
But as far as I can tell, it'll still return it'll still return an MST, even if it can't satisfy anything in the advanced advanced set.
Right, because if you want something that it must satisfy, that's what the required constraints are for. And there's no point in having multiple levels of them because it's got to satisfy them or it'll give you an error.
I think we're introducing a lot of complexity with not any without not any clear use. Yeah.
No, it's exactly the use case we gave of tying constraints together, and required constraints are automatically tied together. We now have the advanced constraints are tied together. And if you want multiple levels of backoff with a minimum, you put the minimum in required, and then you put the levels, the desired with the levels of backoff in advanced, and you get exactly what you want.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I don't think this is the appropriate discussion really, because we have had the advanced in there for ages. It was just called optional constraints, and it was exactly the same functionality.
I was look. I'm fine with this. Maybe my problem is I don't like the algorithm being that specified in the document. If we do that and let the user agent have the flexibility to meet advanced any way that it wants to, then that's fine with me too.
But come with feedback on the algorithm then. I mean, if there are details in it you don't like.
I already said I gave my feedback over the weekend. Nobody responded. I put it in my email. I have it in there. I said that this is not the only way to do this.
Anyway, I think the advanced constraints, which were previously called the optional ones, I think they have been there for a couple of years.
Okay.
And there's a lot of consensus.
I'll withdraw. Let's move this debate on. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So just to verify the consensus of the group, raise two questions, or raise your hands. So two questions will be: raise your hand if you're satisfied with leaving the advanced part in, possibly refining the algorithm as everything gets refined, leaving advanced in roughly as it is now. And the other question will be not happy with leaving the advanced in. So there will be, it's allowed to not care too, but I think we have to, and I think I have to ask a question, basically. So who's okay with leaving the advanced in the spec?
This is kind of weird. I just am surprised that this is a question without, I mean, it's just all of a sudden there's this question that is coming up now, spur of the moment. Do we leave this in or do we take it out? And for something that's been there for a long time.
No, that was not the question. The question was, are you happy with leaving it in, or are you not happy with leaving it in? The action for the people who are not happy is
okay. Thank you. That's the clarification I needed. Thanks.
So we're just asking, are we okay with it being in as opposed to expressing any preference?
Okay with leaving it in, or not okay with leaving it in? Yes. As opposed to specifying any preference for alternate solution and so on.
Okay.
Okay. Okay with leaving it in? Not okay with leaving it in? We have a rough consensus to leave it in. Details will be discussed on list.
Yeah, I mean, I just add one thing that people are taking umbrage or not understanding the fact that there's a difference between the ordered set of optional constraints and what was actually written in the spec, which is something relatively new, which is the algorithm for which a UA must actually evaluate it. That's very specific, and that's not something that is.
Please make comments on the algorithm.
I have
on the list.
I have.
on the list.
I have I have done that.
We'll try to parse them again. Okay, with that, I think we have done enough work for 1 hour, and lunch is ready. And we'll start again at. Let's try to rush things a bit and start again at 1 o'clock exactly. Okay. Okay. I think we'll reconvene at 1, because if we end early, that's no problem. But can you check with the Ivy guide to see if I can make that? Thank you.
Done sooner than August 15th. I regret saying that. I was just giving shit. No, it's fair. It's totally fair. As I said, I regretted saying it the instant it came out of my mouth. I was, yeah, yeah. That's all I was going through my head, and whatever. That's reverted. All right, so the executive summary here. When you find a problem that nobody is really happy with the outcome, you come in. Capitalize on opportunities.